The winter of 1878 arrived like a biblical plague across the territories of Colorado, carrying with it the kind of cold that settled into men's bones and refused to leave. Snow fell in thick, relentless curtains that transformed the landscape into an endless expanse of white desolation. It was the kind of weather that killed the unprepared and tested the resolve of even the hardiest souls who called this unforgiving land home. Eleanor Hartwell pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders as she struggled through the deepening drifts, her breath forming desperate clouds in the frigid air. Each step forward required tremendous effort, her worn boots sinking deep into snow that reached past her knees. Behind her, clutched in arms that ached from the cold and exhaustion, she carried a leather satchel that contained the most precious cargo imaginable. Not gold or silver, but something far more valuable in this lawless territory: the truth. Her 6-year-old son Benjamin trudged beside her, his small face red and raw from the biting wind. The boy had learned early in his short life that survival meant silence, that complaints and tears were luxuries they could not afford. His mittens, patched and repatched by his mother's careful hands, gripped the edge of her coat as they moved through the storm like two ghosts haunting the white wilderness. "Mama," Benjamin whispered, his voice barely audible above the howling wind, "I can't feel my feet anymore." Eleanor's heart clenched at the fear in her son's voice, but she forced her own terror deep down where it could not show on her face. She had become an expert at hiding her fear over the past 3 months, ever since the night her husband Thomas was murdered for refusing to stay silent about the corruption he had discovered. Since that terrible evening when their world collapsed and they became fugitives in their own country. "Just a little further, sweetheart," she said, though she had no idea if this was true. The landmarks she had been following had disappeared beneath the snow hours ago, and the gathering darkness made navigation impossible. "We'll find shelter soon." The leather satchel bounced against her hip with each labored step, its contents representing the hopes and futures of 200 families who had settled this land under the Homestead Act of 1862. Thomas had spent months gathering evidence of the Atlantic and Pacific Railroad Company's illegal land grab, documenting how they had forged documents and murdered honest settlers to steal nearly 50,000 acres of prime territory. The railroad barons believed they could buy or kill their way to whatever they wanted, but Thomas Hartwell had been a man who believed in justice above profit. That belief had cost him his life. Eleanor stumbled, nearly losing her footing as exhaustion overwhelmed her careful steps. The weight of the satchel seemed to increase with each mile, not because of its physical mass, but because of the enormous responsibility it represented. If she failed to reach the territorial capital, if these documents were lost or destroyed, then Thomas's death would have been meaningless. 200 families would lose their homes to corporate greed, and the corruption would continue to spread like a cancer across the frontier. Benjamin stopped walking and looked up at his mother with eyes that held far too much understanding for a child his age. "Are the bad men still following us, Mama?" Eleanor glanced over her shoulder at the empty white expanse behind them, but she knew that Marcus Ashford's hired killers were out there somewhere in the storm. The railroad baron had made it clear that he would stop at nothing to recover the documents and eliminate anyone who knew the truth about his criminal enterprise. She had seen what his men were capable of when they murdered Thomas, and she knew they would show no mercy to a woman and child. "Don't worry about the bad men," she said, forcing a confidence into her voice that she did not feel. "God will protect us." The words felt hollow even as she spoke them. Where had God been when Thomas was beaten to death in their barn? Where was divine protection when corrupt sheriffs looked the other way, while innocent families were driven from their homes? Eleanor had always been a woman of faith, but recent events had tested that faith to its very limits. A distant sound carried across the wind, barely perceptible but unmistakably the thunder of horse hooves against frozen ground. Eleanor's blood turned to ice as she recognized the rhythm of riders moving at speed, their mounts churning through the snow with the determination of predators closing in on wounded prey. Ashford's men had found their trail. "Benjamin, we have to run," she said, grabbing her son's hand and pulling him forward with renewed urgency. The boy did not question or complain, but Eleanor could feel his small body trembling with exhaustion and cold as they stumbled through the deepening snow. Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew louder and more distinct. She could make out individual voices now, rough men calling to each other as they coordinated their hunt. Eleanor's lungs burned as she pushed herself beyond the limits of endurance, dragging Benjamin along as fast as his short legs could carry him. The satchel banged against her side with each desperate stride, a constant reminder of what was at stake. She could hear the riders spreading out now, flanking them to prevent escape. These were experienced gunmen who knew their business well. When Benjamin stumbled and fell face first into the snow, Eleanor felt her heart break. The boy struggled to stand, his small frame shaking with cold and exhaustion, but his legs could carry him no further. She scooped him into her arms, feeling his weight settle against her already aching muscles, and continued forward, though she knew it was hopeless. The sound of horses was very close now, close enough that she could hear the labored breathing of the animals and the jingle of saddle hardware. Male voices carried clearly through the thin air, speaking in the casual tones of men who were confident in their ability to complete their murderous task. "Tracks lead this way, boss," called one rider. "Can't be more than a quarter-mile ahead." "Good," came the reply in a voice that Eleanor recognized with a chill of terror. Silas Croft, Ashford's chief enforcer, was a man who took pleasure in the suffering of others. The boss wants those papers burned and the woman silenced permanent-like. The kid, too, if he's seen too much. Eleanor pressed her face against Benjamin's snow-covered hair and whispered a prayer that she hoped someone, somewhere, might hear. She had tried so hard to honor her husband's memory and continue his fight for justice, but it seemed that evil men with enough money could always triumph over right and truth. That was when she heard a different sound cutting through the storm, a sound that made her pursuers suddenly rein in their horses with curses of alarm. The unmistakable crack of a rifle shot echoed across the white landscape, followed immediately by the scream of a wounded horse and the thud of a body hitting frozen ground. Cole Brennan had been tracking the Donovan gang for 3 weeks when the blizzard struck, forcing him to take shelter in a shallow cave that overlooked the valley below. As a bounty hunter and former cavalry officer, he had learned to read weather patterns like other men read newspapers, and he knew this storm would be a killer for anyone caught unprepared in the open country. From his position among the rocks, Cole watched the drama unfolding in the snow-covered meadow below through the lens of his field glasses, the same military-issue equipment that had served him well during his years of service in the Union Army. What he saw made his jaw tighten with the kind of controlled anger that had kept him alive through 4 years of civil war and 6 years of hunting dangerous men across the frontier territories. 5 riders were pursuing a woman and small child through the deep snow, their intentions clearly murderous based on the weapons they carried and the predatory way they moved to cut off escape routes. Cole had seen enough violence in his 35 years to recognize a killing party when he saw one, and everything about this situation spoke of innocent people being hunted by hired assassins. The woman carrying the child had reached the limits of human endurance. Cole could see her staggering steps and the way she clutched her burden protectively, even as her own body began to fail. Behind her, the riders were closing the distance with methodical precision, like wolves running down a wounded deer. Cole Brennan was not a man who believed in coincidence or divine intervention, but he did believe in the code that had been drilled into him during his cavalry service. Protect the innocent, stand against injustice, never abandon a fellow human being to the predations of evil men. These principles had cost him dearly over the years, but they remained the bedrock of who he was beneath the weathered exterior and accumulated scars. He pulled his Winchester rifle from its leather scabbard and checked the action with methodical precision, the familiar weight of the weapon settling into his hands like an old friend. The range was long for accurate shooting, especially in these wind conditions, but Cole had learned marksmanship under some of the finest instructors the Army could provide. More importantly, he had refined those skills through years of combat where missing your target meant death for yourself and your fellow soldiers. The lead rider was now close enough that Cole could see the cruel satisfaction on his weathered face as he prepared to run down the exhausted woman. This man rode with the confident posture of someone who had killed before and expected no resistance from his victims. His mistake was assuming that no one else was watching. Cole's first shot took the lead rider's center mass, the heavy .44 caliber bullet spinning the man from his saddle like a child's toy. The sound of the gunshot cracked across the valley like thunder, causing the remaining riders to wheel their horses in confusion as they tried to locate the source of the attack. The second shot dropped another rider's horse, sending both animal and man tumbling into the snow in a tangle of thrashing limbs. Cole was already working the lever action of his rifle and acquiring his next target before the echoes of the previous shots had faded. "Up in the rocks!" shouted one of the surviving riders, pointing toward Cole's position. "Someone's got us in a crossfire!" There was no crossfire, of course, but men under unexpected attack often heard gunshots that were not there and saw enemies in every shadow. Fear and confusion were Cole's allies now, as he used his elevated position to maximum advantage. His third shot shattered the shoulder of a rider who was trying to charge up the slope toward his hiding place, the impact spinning the man around and sending him sliding from his saddle to land hard in the snow. The remaining two riders decided that discretion was the better part of valor and spurred their horses away from the killing ground, disappearing into the swirling snow like ghosts. Cole remained in position for several minutes, scanning the area through his rifle scope to ensure that the retreat was genuine and not a tactical maneuver. Only when he was satisfied that the immediate threat had passed did he emerge from cover and begin making his way down the rocky slope toward the woman and child. The snow was knee-deep and treacherous underfoot, but Cole moved with the sure-footed confidence of a man who had spent years traversing difficult terrain in all weather conditions. His cavalry boots, though worn and patched, still provided excellent traction on the icy surface, and his long coat turned aside the worst of the wind-driven snow. As he approached the woman, Cole could see that she had collapsed to her knees in the snow, still holding the child protectively against her chest. Her dark hair had escaped from beneath her woolen cap and hung in frozen strands around a face that might have been beautiful under better circumstances. Now it showed only exhaustion and the kind of bone-deep fear that came from being hunted by killers. The child appeared to be a boy of perhaps 6 years, with large, dark eyes that watched Cole's approach with the wariness of someone who had learned not to trust strangers. The boy's clothes were well made but worn thin from hard use, and Cole could see the signs of recent travel in the mud-stained fabric and careful patches. "Ma'am," Cole said, stopping a respectful distance away and keeping his rifle pointed toward the ground. "I'm Cole Brennan. Those men won't be troubling you anymore." Eleanor looked up at the tall figure standing before her, trying to process what had just happened. The man was clearly a frontiersman, dressed in the practical clothing of someone who lived and worked in harsh country. His face was weathered and scarred, with the kind of hard lines that came from years of outdoor living and exposure to violence. But his eyes, she noticed, held none of the cruel satisfaction she had seen in the faces of her pursuers. "Are they dead?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Some of them," Cole replied matter-of-factly. "The others rode off, but they might come back with reinforcements. We need to get you and the boy somewhere safe." Eleanor tried to stand, but her legs betrayed her after the desperate flight through the snow. She would have fallen if Cole had not stepped forward to steady her with a strong hand on her elbow. Even through the thick fabric of his gloves, she could feel the controlled strength in his grip. "Thank you," she managed, fighting back tears of relief and exhaustion. "I thought we were going to die." "Not on my watch," Cole said quietly. "Can you walk if I help you?" Eleanor nodded, though she was not entirely certain this was true. Benjamin stirred in her arms, looking up at the stranger with curious eyes that held far too much understanding for his age. "Are you a soldier, mister?" the boy asked in a small voice. "Used to be," Cole replied, surprised by the directness of the question. "Long time ago. My papa was going to be a soldier," Benjamin continued, seemingly unaware of the pain that flickered across his mother's face. "But then he got killed by bad men." The simple statement hit Cole like a physical blow, bringing back memories of his own losses that he had spent years trying to bury. He looked at the exhausted woman and frightened child with new understanding, recognizing the particular kind of grief that came from sudden and violent loss. "Well then," Cole said, his voice gentler than before, "I guess it's my job to make sure nothing happens to you and your mama. Can you do that? Help me take care of her?" Benjamin nodded solemnly, as if accepting a sacred trust. "Yes, sir, I'm real good at taking care of Mama." Cole believed him. The boy had the prematurely serious demeanor of a child who had been forced to grow up too fast, something Cole understood from personal experience. War and violence had a way of stealing childhood from the young, replacing innocence with hard-earned wisdom about the cruel realities of the world. "My cabin is about 2 miles from here," Cole said. adjusting his grip on Eleanor's arm as they began to move through the snow. It's well hidden and defensible. You'll be safe there while we figure out our next move. Eleanor wanted to ask who those men were and why they had been trying to kill her, but she sensed that this man already knew more than he was saying. There was something in his manner that suggested familiarity with violence and those who dealt in it. For now, it was enough that he had saved their lives and was offering continued protection. As they made their slow way through the deepening snow, Eleanor found herself studying her rescuer more carefully. Cole Brennan moved with the fluid efficiency of someone accustomed to dangerous situations, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings for threats. His rifle remained ready in his hands, not pointed at them, but available for instant use if needed. "Those men who were chasing you," Cole said as they crested a small rise, "they weren't common bandits. They moved like professionals. Military training, maybe, or law enforcement background." Eleanor's grip tightened on the leather satchel she had managed to retain through their flight. "They work for the railroad," she said quietly. "Marcus Ashford specifically. They killed my husband because he discovered evidence of their land fraud schemes." Cole nodded grimly. He had heard rumors about railroad corruption throughout the territories, stories of forged documents and mysterious disappearances of homesteaders who refused to sell their claims. It seemed those rumors had been understated rather than exaggerated. "What kind of evidence?" he asked. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, weighing whether she could trust this stranger with information that had already cost her husband his life. But something in Cole's steady demeanor and the gentle way he had spoken to Benjamin convinced her that he was genuinely trying to help. "Legal documents proving that the Atlantic and Pacific Railroad Company has been forging homestead claims and murdering legitimate settlers to steal their land. Thomas spent months gathering proof of their crimes. Nearly 50,000 acres and 200 families affected." The scope of the corruption made Cole whistle softly under his breath. Corporate greed was nothing new in the territories, but this represented a conspiracy on a massive scale. No wonder Ashford was willing to send killers after a woman and child to recover the evidence. "And you've got these documents with you?" Cole asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Eleanor nodded, unconsciously adjusting her grip on the satchel. "Thomas hid copies in several places, but this is the only complete set. If something happens to these papers, there's no way to prove what Ashford has done." They walked in silence for several minutes, the only sounds the crunch of their footsteps in the snow and the whistle of wind through the bare trees. Cole was thinking hard about the implications of what Eleanor had told him. Ashford was a powerful man with connections throughout the territorial government and beyond. Taking him down would require more than just documentary evidence. It would take careful planning and probably federal intervention. "There's something else you should know," Cole said as his cabin came into view through the trees. "I'm not just a random good Samaritan who happened to be in the right place. I've been tracking a gang of killers for the past 3 weeks, men who work for various criminal enterprises throughout the territory. Some of them have connections to railroad companies." Eleanor looked at him with new understanding. "You're a bounty hunter." "Among other things," Cole confirmed. "And based on what you've told me, I think your husband's murder and my investigation might be connected. The men I've been hunting have been eliminating witnesses and stealing documents related to land fraud schemes." This revelation sent a chill through Eleanor that had nothing to do with the winter cold. If Cole was right, then Thomas's death was just one small part of a much larger criminal conspiracy. The implications were staggering and terrifying. As they approached Cole's cabin, Eleanor could see why he had described it as defensible. The structure was built into a natural depression surrounded by rocks and thick trees, making it nearly invisible from a distance. The logs were thick and well chinked, and she could see firing ports that had been carefully disguised as decorative elements. "You built this place expecting trouble," she observed. "In my line of work, trouble has a way of finding you whether you expect it or not," Cole replied. "Better to be prepared and not need the preparations than the other way around." The interior of the cabin was spartanly furnished but clean and well organized. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a good supply of split wood stacked nearby. Simple wooden furniture filled the space efficiently, and Eleanor could see evidence of a man who lived alone but took pride in his surroundings. What caught her attention most, however, were the small touches that spoke of a different life. A wooden cradle sat in one corner, carefully maintained but obviously unused for years. Children's clothes hung on pegs near the fireplace, tiny garments that had been preserved with loving care. On the mantel sat a daguerreotype of a beautiful woman holding a small girl, both faces bright with happiness and life. Benjamin noticed these things too, his young eyes taking in details that adults might miss. "Did you have a little girl, Mr. Cole?" he asked with the innocent directness of childhood. Cole's face went very still, and for a moment Eleanor thought he would not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I did. Her name was Sarah. She and her mama died of fever 6 years ago." The simple statement carried such weight of grief that Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes. She understood now why Cole had been so quick to help them, why he had risked his life to save strangers in a snowstorm. He was trying to save the family he had not been able to protect. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I know how much it hurts to lose someone you love." Cole nodded without speaking, busying himself with building up the fire and preparing simple food for his unexpected guests. Eleanor watched him work, noting the careful precision of his movements and the way he seemed to find comfort in routine tasks. She recognized the behavior of someone who had learned to manage grief through activity and purpose. Benjamin, with the resilience of childhood, had already begun exploring the cabin with careful curiosity. He paused before the daguerreotype on the mantel, studying the faces of Cole's lost family with solemn attention. "They look happy," the boy said softly. "I bet they loved you a lot." Cole's hand stilled on the coffee pot he had been preparing. "They did," he said after a moment. "Just like your papa loved you and your mama." It was the kind of simple truth that children could accept more easily than adults, and Benjamin nodded with understanding beyond his years. Eleanor felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the growing fire. This hard, scarred man had just given her son a precious gift, the knowledge that love persists even after death. As the evening wore on and the storm continued to rage outside, Eleanor found herself relaxing for the first time in months. Cole proved to be a considerate host, sharing his simple food and ensuring that both she and Benjamin were warm and comfortable. More importantly, she sensed that they were truly safe for the first time since Thomas's murder. But as she watched Cole clean his rifle with trained automatism and check the loads in his revolvers, she was reminded that this safety was temporary. Somewhere out in the storm, Marcus Ashford's killers were regrouping and planning their next move. The evidence in her satchel represented a threat that powerful men would kill to eliminate. "What happens next?" she asked as Benjamin dozed by the fire, exhausted by their ordeal. Cole looked up from his weapons maintenance, his expression serious. "That depends on how badly Ashford wants those documents. If he's willing to send killers after a woman and child in a blizzard, he won't give up easy." "Then we fight," Eleanor said, with more conviction than she felt. "We?" Cole raised an eyebrow. "This isn't your fight anymore, ma'am. I can get you and the boy to safety, somewhere Ashford can't reach you." Eleanor shook her head firmly. "Those documents represent justice for my husband and 200 other families. I won't run away and hide while evil men profit from murder and theft." Cole studied her face in the firelight, seeing the steel beneath the feminine exterior. She was scared, certainly, but she was also determined to honor her husband's memory and continue his fight for justice. It was the kind of courage that he had seen in the best of his fellow soldiers, the willingness to stand against overwhelming odds for principle rather than personal gain. "All right then," he said quietly, "we fight. But we do it smart, not desperate. Ashford has money and men, but we have something he doesn't." "What's that?" "We're right, and sometimes if you're patient and careful, that's enough." Outside the cabin, the wind howled with increasing ferocity as the blizzard reached its full intensity. Snow piled against the windows and door, temporarily isolating them from the outside world and its dangers. But Eleanor knew that when the storm passed, the real battle would begin. She looked at Benjamin, sleeping peacefully by the fire, then at Cole Brennan, methodically preparing for whatever was to come. For the first time since Thomas's death, she felt hope beginning to kindle in her chest. She was no longer alone in her fight for justice. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and dangers, but tonight they were safe. Tonight, they could plan and prepare and remember what they were fighting for. And if God was willing and their courage held, they might just survive long enough to see justice done. The fire crackled and popped as fresh logs caught flame, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside there was warmth and purpose, and the beginning of something that might, with luck and determination, grow into hope for a better future. The blizzard's fury had exhausted itself during the night, leaving behind a crystalline world of pristine white that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Cole Brennan stood at his cabin's single window, steam rising from the tin cup of coffee cradled in his weathered hands, as he studied the transformed landscape with the practiced eye of a man who had learned to read death in every shadow and movement. The silence that followed such storms was deceptive, Cole knew. It carried the illusion of peace, while masking the approach of those who dealt in violence and corruption. Through his field glasses, the same military issue equipment that had served him faithfully during 4 years of civil war, he could make out the telltale signs of watchers positioning themselves along the distant ridgeline. Behind him, Eleanor stirred Benjamin awake with gentle touches, the boy's sleepy protests quickly fading as he remembered their circumstances. The child had shown remarkable resilience throughout their ordeal, adapting to danger with the frightening ease that children sometimes displayed when thrust into adult troubles too large for their understanding. "How long before they come?" Eleanor asked quietly, joining Cole at the window while Benjamin dressed himself by the fire that had burned low during the night. "Not long," Cole replied, his voice carrying the calm certainty of a man who had faced such moments many times before. He pointed toward barely visible movement among the snow-laden pines. "They've been out there since before sunrise, probably spent the night in whatever shelter they could scrape together. Ashford's men are professionals, and they learn from their mistakes." Eleanor followed his gaze, her heart sinking as she realized how exposed their position truly was in the harsh light of day. The cabin's defensive advantages, so reassuring in darkness, seemed inadequate against the multiple approaches she could now see spreading out from the tree line like fingers of approaching death. Cole seemed to read the fear growing in her expression. "Don't let the daylight fool you," he said with quiet confidence. "This place has more tricks than it shows from the outside. I did not survive Gettysburg and 6 years of hunting killers by building myself an easy target." He moved away from the window and began his morning ritual of weapons preparation, checking each firearm with the methodical precision that had become second nature during his years of violence. His Winchester rifle received fresh cartridges, the brass cases sliding into the magazine with satisfying clicks. His pair of Colt revolvers were cleaned, loaded, and returned to their holsters with military discipline. "Benjamin," Cole called to the boy, who was now fully dressed and watching the adult preparations with eyes that held too much understanding for his tender years. "I need you to be my scout today. Think you can handle that responsibility?" The child straightened his small shoulders with obvious pride at being assigned an important role in their defense. "Yes, sir, Mr. Cole. What do I need to watch for?" "Movement where there shouldn't be any. Sounds that don't belong in these woods. Birds flying up sudden-like, which means someone disturbed them." Cole knelt to the boy's level, his expression serious but kind. "This is important work, Benjamin. I'm counting on you to help me keep your mama safe." Eleanor felt her throat constrict as she watched her son accept such adult responsibility with solemn dignity. She understood that Cole was giving Benjamin purpose rather than allowing him to feel helpless, transforming potential terror into useful activity. It was a kindness disguised as military necessity. The attack, when it came, unfolded with the methodical precision that Cole had expected from mercenaries. 8 men approached the cabin, advanced scouts from Croft's main force designed to surround the cabin and eliminate any possibility of escape. They had clearly studied the previous day's engagement and adjusted their tactics accordingly, approaching with the caution of predators who had learned to respect their prey's capabilities. Benjamin provided the first warning, his sharp whisper cutting through the morning air like a blade. "Mr. Cole, there's men moving in the trees on the left side. 2 of them, trying to stay hidden but not doing it very well." Bonnie, Cole nodded approvingly at the boy's observation and moved to a firing port that offered a clear view of the area Benjamin had indicated. Through the carefully disguised opening, concealed within what appeared to be decorative woodwork, he could see 2 figures working their way through the snow-covered undergrowth with movements that were cautious but determined. These men carried themselves like soldiers, Cole noted with professional interest. Their spacing was correct, their weapons handling competent, Their advance coordinated with hand signals that spoke of military training. Ashford was clearly escalating his response, bringing in higher quality personnel for this engagement. "Eleanor," Cole said quietly, never taking his eyes from the approaching threat, "there's a double-barreled shotgun hanging on the wall behind you. Thomas ever teach you to use one?" "He did," she replied, though her voice betrayed the nervousness she was trying to suppress. "I'm not sure I can actually point it at another human being and pull the trigger." "You won't have to unless they get past me," Cole assured her with calm confidence. "But if that happens, you remember that they're here to kill your son. You protect Benjamin first and worry about their feelings afterward." The first shots erupted from the ridge line like thunder rolling across the valley, rifle fire intended to pin Cole down, while the assault teams maneuvered into position. Heavy bullets splintered the thick log walls and shattered one of the cabin's small windows, filling the interior with flying debris and the acrid smell of burned gunpowder. Cole returned fire through his prepared shooting ports, each shot carefully aimed and devastatingly effective. The Winchester's powerful .44 caliber bullets found their targets with deadly precision, dropping one attacker immediately and sending another crawling for cover while clutching a shattered shoulder that would never function properly again. But Cole quickly realized that this engagement was fundamentally different from their previous encounter. These men had come prepared for an extended siege, and they possessed both the ammunition and the discipline necessary to sustain coordinated fire for as long as necessary. This was not a simple elimination mission carried out by hired thugs. This was a military operation conducted by experienced professionals. "They're trying to get around to the back door," Benjamin reported from his position near a small side window, his young voice remaining remarkably steady despite the chaos erupting around them. Cole spun toward the cabin's rear entrance, arriving just as the heavy wooden door exploded inward under the concentrated impact of a shotgun blast that filled the air with splinters and smoke. Two men rushed through the destroyed opening immediately, their weapons raised and ready to kill anyone they encountered in the confined space. The first attacker never had the opportunity to fire his weapon. Cole's revolver spoke twice in rapid succession, the heavy .45 caliber bullets spinning the man around like a child's toy before dropping him in a lifeless heap just inside the doorway. The second intruder managed to discharge one wild shot that gouged splinters from the opposite wall before Cole's third bullet found its mark with terminal precision. Eleanor's scream pierced the air as gunfire erupted inside their small sanctuary, the sound deafeningly loud in the confined space and overwhelming in its sudden violence. She pulled Benjamin protectively behind the thick wooden table that Cole had positioned for exactly this purpose, her hands shaking uncontrollably as she gripped the shotgun that suddenly felt impossibly heavy in her inexperienced grasp. "Stay down and keep quiet," Cole shouted over the continuing rifle fire from the attackers outside. "They're trying to make us panic, force us into making mistakes that will get us killed." He moved back toward the front firing ports while reloading his revolver with practiced efficiency, the brass cartridges sliding into their chambers with mechanical precision, even as his mind calculated angles and distances. Through the openings in the cabin's walls, he could see muzzle flashes from multiple positions as the remaining attackers maintained their suppressing fire. The assault was clearly designed to overwhelm a single defender through sheer volume of firepower. But Cole had faced worse odds during the war. At Gettysburg, he had held a position against Confederate cavalry with only 3 other men, using superior positioning and careful ammunition management to defeat a force 3 times their size. More importantly, this cabin possessed advantages that his attackers did not fully understand. Cole had spent years perfecting its defensive capabilities, creating overlapping fields of fire and carefully prepared fallback positions that could channel enemy movement into predetermined killing zones. The next phase of the attack revealed the tactical sophistication of their enemies. Instead of another poorly coordinated rush, the remaining men attempted a simultaneous assault from multiple directions, using covering fire and coordinated movement to minimize their exposure while maximizing pressure on the defense. But Cole had anticipated such tactics and prepared accordingly. Hidden beneath the innocent-appearing snow around the cabin's perimeter, he had positioned a series of sharpened stakes, each one hardened in fire and angled to penetrate deep into the leg or torso of anyone who stepped on them. The obstacles were carefully camouflaged and positioned to funnel attackers into specific areas where Cole's defensive fire would be most effective. The first man to encounter these hidden defenses went down with a scream of agony that shattered the coordination of the entire assault. His leg, impaled completely through by a stake that protruded from both sides of his thigh, pinned him helplessly in the snow, while his lifeblood drained away in spreading crimson stains. His cries of pain and terror broke the discipline of his companions, who stopped their advance to provide aid rather than continuing their coordinated attack. The sight of their comrades' suffering destroyed the professional detachment necessary for effective military operations, reducing trained killers to frightened men who suddenly understood their own mortality. Cole took immediate advantage of their confusion, delivering precise rifle fire that dropped another attacker and wounded a third badly enough to remove him from the fight. The careful coordination that had marked the beginning of their assault dissolved into desperate individual efforts at survival as each man sought whatever cover he could find. "How many are left out there?" Eleanor called from behind her protective barrier, her voice strained but growing steadier as the immediate crisis began to resolve in their favor. "3, maybe 4, Cole replied while quickly reloading his rifle with fresh cartridges. "But they'll regroup and try something different. These aren't the kind of men who retreat just because they've taken casualties." His prediction proved accurate within minutes. The surviving attackers had withdrawn to the tree line to reassess their situation and develop new tactics, but Cole could see movement among the pines that suggested they were far from finished with their assault. The next attack came from an entirely unexpected direction and demonstrated a level of tactical creativity that surprised even Cole's experienced judgment. Instead of another direct assault on the cabin's defenses, the remaining men began throwing burning brands onto the roof, using fire as a weapon to force their targets into the open, where they could be eliminated with conventional firearms. The dry wooden shingles caught fire quickly despite the recent snowfall, and smoke began filtering down through the ceiling as flames spread across the surface with alarming speed. The acrid smell of burning wood filled the cabin's interior, making breathing difficult and visibility poor. "We have to get out of here," Eleanor said, coughing as the smoke thickened and began to sting her eyes. "We'll suffocate if we stay." "Not yet," Cole replied with grim determination, his tactical mind working through the options available to them. "That's exactly what they want. They're positioned outside just waiting for us to run out into their guns." Instead of abandoning their defensive position, Cole grabbed a bucket of water that he had kept ready for exactly this type of emergency and climbed quickly to the cabin's small loft area. Working frantically despite the increasing smoke and heat, he managed to douse the worst of the flames before they could spread to the main support beams that held the entire structure together. The attackers, frustrated by their failure to smoke out their intended victims, made the critical mistake of moving closer to observe the results of their fire attack. They wanted to confirm that their strategy was working before committing to their final assault, but their curiosity exposed them to Cole's defensive fire. Shooting from the loft window, Cole caught 2 men completely in the open as they tried to get a better view of the burning roof. His rifle fire dropped them both with precisely aimed shots that ended their participation in the battle permanently. The heavy bullets struck with devastating impact, spinning the men around before they collapsed into the snow, where they lay motionless. The sole surviving attacker, suddenly alone and facing an opponent who had systematically eliminated his entire team, abandoned any pretense of completing his mission. He attempted to flee toward the distant tree line where the horses were picketed, but fear made him careless about his route selection. Cole's final shot of the engagement caught the fleeing man before he could reach safety, sending him tumbling face first into the snow, where he lay still and silent. The sudden quiet that followed seemed almost unnatural after the sustained violence of the past hour. In the aftermath of the battle, Cole climbed down from the loft and surveyed the damage to his carefully maintained home. The roof would require extensive repairs before the next storm arrived, and there were bullet holes throughout the walls that would need to be patched to maintain the cabin's weather resistance. But they had survived, and more importantly, the precious documents that Eleanor carried remained safe. "Is it really over this time?" Benjamin asked in a small voice, peering cautiously from behind the protective table where his mother still held him close. "For now," Cole replied honestly, though his mind was already working through the implications of what had just occurred. "But Ashford won't give up. He's got too much at stake to let this go. He'll send more men, probably better equipped, and certainly more careful about their approach." Eleanor stood slowly, her legs unsteady from the adrenaline and fear that had sustained her through the violent encounter. She looked around the cabin at the signs of destruction and death, trying to process the reality of what they had just experienced together. "You saved our lives again," she said quietly, her voice carrying a weight of gratitude that words seemed inadequate to express. "We're far from safe," Cole warned, his professional assessment cutting through any false comfort that their tactical victory might provide. "This was just Ashford testing our defenses and capabilities. The next attack will be bigger, better planned, and much harder to survive." Cole's decision to abandon the cabin came after careful consideration of their strategic position and the resources available to their enemies. The defensive advantages that had served them well in this engagement would become liabilities if Ashford decided to commit significant numbers of men to a prolonged siege. "We leave within the hour," Cole announced as he gathered essential supplies and ammunition. "Travel light, move fast, and put as much distance as possible between us and this place before they bring up reinforcements." Eleanor packed only the most critical items, including the leather satchel that contained Thomas's carefully gathered evidence. Benjamin was bundled in extra clothing that Cole had found among the preserved belongings of his lost family. The sight of another child wearing his daughter's garments bringing back painful memories that he pushed firmly aside. The first day traveling from the cabin toward Red Mesa took them through country that Cole knew intimately from his years of hunting dangerous men across the territorial wilderness. They followed established game trails when possible, but frequently had to break their own path through snow that reached nearly to Benjamin's waist. The boy's energy and enthusiasm impressed Cole throughout the difficult day. Benjamin asked countless questions about wilderness survival, animal tracking, and the techniques that Cole used to navigate without clear landmarks. The child's eager curiosity provided a welcome distraction from the grim realities of their situation. "How do you know which way to go when everything looks the same?" Benjamin asked during one of their brief rest stops. "You learn to read the signs that nature provides," Cole explained, pointing to subtle indicators in the landscape around them. "The way moss grows on tree trunks, how snow drifts against rocks, the direction water flows when it melts. The wilderness talks to you if you know how to listen." Eleanor watched these interactions with growing appreciation for the man who had become their protector and guide. Cole was not merely keeping them alive. He was teaching Benjamin valuable lessons about self-reliance and observation that would serve the boy well regardless of what the future might hold. But as the day progressed, Cole began to notice signs that their enemies were still pursuing them with professional determination. Disturbed snow in areas where no legitimate travelers should have passed, the remains of hasty camps that showed evidence of multiple horses and armed men, and the occasional glimpse of distant riders who disappeared whenever he tried to get a closer look. "They're still following us," Eleanor observed during one of Cole's longer examinations of their back trail. "At least 6 men, maybe more," Cole confirmed grimly. "Staying back, trying not to be seen, but definitely tracking our movements." Ashford's brought in some serious talent for this operation. The pursuit became more obvious as they entered less familiar territory, where Cole's knowledge of hidden paths and shortcuts became less reliable. The men following them were clearly experienced trackers who understood how to read sign in winter conditions, and they were gradually closing the distance despite Cole's efforts to obscure their trail. On the second day, they encountered clear evidence that their route had been anticipated. Cole spotted the ambush before they walked into it, recognizing the unnatural positioning of fallen logs and snow-covered boulders that concealed waiting gunmen with clear fields of fire across the only viable path through a narrow valley. "Get down and stay quiet," Cole whispered urgently, pulling Eleanor and Benjamin behind a massive pine tree just as the first rifle shots cracked across the frozen air. The ambush had been expertly planned and positioned, with shooters placed to catch travelers in a deadly crossfire as they followed what appeared to be the only available route through the difficult terrain. But the attackers had revealed their positions too early, firing at maximum range rather than waiting for their targets to close distance. "Stay here with Benjamin," Cole told Eleanor as he checked his weapons and studied the enemy positions through his field glasses. "I'm going to work around behind them and see if I can even the odds." "Please be careful," Eleanor replied, though she knew the inadequacy of such words even as she spoke them. Cole moved through the snow-covered forest with the practiced stealth of a man who had spent years approaching dangerous prey without being detected. His cavalry training during the war had taught him the fundamentals of reconnaissance and infiltration, skills that had been refined through countless encounters with armed criminals who would kill him without hesitation if they discovered his presence. The first gunman never realized his danger until Cole's knife found his throat, eliminating one threat silently and without alerting his companions to the deadly presence moving among them. The second sentry turned just in time to see death approaching, but Cole's gloved hand over his mouth prevented any warning cry. The remaining ambushers, realizing that something had gone catastrophically wrong with their carefully prepared trap, began calling out to their missing companions. When no answers came from the silent forest, they abandoned their concealed positions and attempted to flee back toward their horses. But Cole had anticipated this reaction and positioned himself to intercept their retreat. His rifle fire caught one man as he tried to mount his horse, the heavy bullet spinning him around and dropping him into the snow, where he lay motionless. The final survivor, seeing his companions dead and his situation hopeless, threw down his weapons and raised his hands in surrender. Cole approached the defeated ambusher with his revolver drawn and ready, his expression cold as winter steel. Professional killers deserved no more mercy than they were prepared to show their intended victims. "Who's paying you?" Cole demanded, though he already knew the general answer. "Marcus Ashford," the man replied without hesitation, clearly understanding that honesty might be his only path to survival. $500 for the woman, $300 for the boy, and bonus if we bring back those documents she's carrying. The casual mention of bounties on Eleanor and Benjamin made Cole's blood run cold with controlled fury. These were not simply hired killers pursuing a specific target. They were bounty hunters, motivated by greed, and completely unconcerned with the lives of innocent people. "How many more are coming?" Cole pressed, his voice carrying the quiet menace of a man who had killed before and would not hesitate to do so again. "Dozen, maybe 15, the gunman admitted, weighing his chances of survival against whatever loyalty he might owe his employer. "Ashford's put out word through every saloon and hiring hall from here to Denver. Says he wants this finished permanent-like." Cole considered his options carefully before making a decision that surprised the captured bounty hunter. Instead of eliminating a potential threat, he took the man's weapons and ammunition, but left him alive with his horse and basic survival supplies. "You ride back to whoever sent you," Cole said as the man prepared to depart. "You tell them that Cole Brennan is protecting these people, and anyone who wants them will have to go through me first. You make sure they understand that I've killed better men than them for lesser reasons." The bounty hunter nodded enthusiastically and spurred his horse away, clearly grateful to escape with his life intact. Cole watched him disappear into the forest, knowing that his message would reach Ashford and escalate their conflict to a distinctly personal level. But that was exactly what Cole wanted. A direct challenge would be easier to prepare for than endless waves of anonymous killers. When Cole returned to Eleanor and Benjamin, he found them exactly where he had left them, the boy's eyes wide with questions he was afraid to ask directly. Eleanor read the grim determination in Cole's expression and understood that their situation had become even more dangerous. "We need to change our approach," Cole announced without preamble. "Running to Red Mesa isn't going to solve our problem. Ashford's got enough men and money to keep sending killers until we make a mistake, or our luck runs out." "What do you suggest?" Eleanor asked, though something in his manner told her that Cole had already formulated a plan. "We take the fight to them," Cole replied. "Start eliminating their people instead of just trying to avoid them. Cut down their numbers and make Ashford think twice about the cost of continuing this war." Eleanor studied his face, seeing the transformation from protector to predator that was taking place behind his battle-worn countenance. This was the soldier emerging, the man who had survived 4 years of civil war by being more dangerous than his enemies. "That means more killing," she said quietly. "It means survival," Cole corrected, "and it means those documents get to people who can use them to bring Ashford to justice. Your husband died for that evidence, and his sacrifice won't mean anything if we let ourselves get murdered in some anonymous forest." The logic was undeniable, even if the implications were frightening. Eleanor nodded her acceptance, understanding that Cole's military experience made him better qualified to judge their tactical situation than her own civilian instincts. That evening, as they sheltered in a cave that Cole had used during previous hunting expeditions, Eleanor found herself drawn into deeper conversation with the man who had become so much more than their protector. The firelight flickered across Cole's scarred features as he shared memories of his service during the war, painting pictures of courage and sacrifice that helped Benjamin understand the history that had shaped their country. "Were you at Gettysburg?" Benjamin asked with the fascination that young boys often showed for tales of military glory. "I was," Cole confirmed, his voice carrying the weight of memories that would never fully fade. 3 days of the worst fighting any of us had ever seen. Men dying by the thousands for a few acres of Pennsylvania farmland. "Did you kill Confederate soldiers?" the boy pressed with morbid curiosity. Cole was quiet for a long moment, considering how to answer such a question honestly without destroying a child's innocence completely. "I did my duty," he finally said, "same as they did theirs. War makes killers of good men, Benjamin. That's why it's something to avoid whenever possible." Eleanor listened to this exchange with growing understanding of the complex man who had saved their lives. Cole carried the weight of decisions made in desperate circumstances, choices that had been necessary for survival, but still left scars on his conscience. As Benjamin eventually dozed by the fire, Eleanor moved closer to where Cole sat maintaining his weapons with practiced efficiency. The intimate setting encouraged confidences that might never have been shared under different circumstances. "Tell me about your family," she said quietly, noting the way Cole's hands stilled on the rifle he was cleaning. For a moment, Eleanor thought he would refuse to answer, but then the words began flowing like water released from a broken dam. Cole spoke of Maria, his wife of 7 years, describing her beauty and strength with the reverence of a man who had truly loved. He told of Sarah, their daughter, who had possessed her mother's dark eyes and a laugh that could brighten the darkest days. "They died while I was away hunting the Donovan gang," Cole said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Fever took them both within 3 days. By the time I got back, they were already buried in the churchyard next to my parents." "That wasn't your fault," Eleanor said with quiet conviction. "Wasn't it?" Cole asked with bitter humor. "I could have been there. Could have gotten them to a doctor, or at least held their hands while they died. Instead, I was chasing bounty money through empty country, while the people I loved most suffered alone." Eleanor reached out and placed her hand over his, feeling the calluses and scars that told the story of a life lived hard. "You can't blame yourself for every tragedy that happens while you're trying to make an honest living. Thomas used to say that guilt was just pride wearing a different face." The observation struck Cole with unexpected force, offering a perspective on his grief that he had never considered. Perhaps his overwhelming guilt was not entirely about love and loss, but also about his inability to control events that had been beyond any mortal influence. "Thomas sounds like he was a wise man," Cole said after a long pause. "He was," Eleanor agreed, "and he would have liked you. He always said that the measure of a man wasn't how much he could accumulate for himself, but how much he was willing to sacrifice for others." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fire burn lower as the night deepened around them. The cave provided excellent concealment and protection from the elements, but Cole remained alert to any sounds that might indicate approaching danger. "Can I tell you something?" Eleanor asked, her voice carrying a note of uncertainty that had not been present before. "Of course." "I think Thomas wrote to you before he died," she said, reaching into her satchel and withdrawing a folded piece of paper that had been carefully preserved. "I found this among his papers after the funeral. It's addressed to Cole Brennan, care of the Territorial Marshal's office in Denver." Cole took the letter with hands that trembled slightly, recognizing his name written in unfamiliar handwriting across the envelope. Inside, he found several pages covered with neat script that revealed information about railroad corruption and a personal message that made his breath catch in his throat. "Cole," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then I am probably dead and my family is in terrible danger. I remember you from the war, though we never served in the same unit. You were the cavalry officer who held the line at Brandy Station when the Confederates broke through. Your courage saved my life and the lives of 50 other men that day." Cole's hands shook as he continued reading, memories flooding back of that terrible battle and the desperate fighting that had characterized the campaign. He had not realized that Thomas Hartwell had been among the men his unit had rescued during that chaotic engagement. The letter continued. I have discovered evidence of massive corruption involving the Atlantic and Pacific Railroad Company. They are stealing land from legitimate homesteaders and murdering anyone who tries to resist. I fear they will come for my family next, and I am sending this evidence to you because you are the only man I know who has both the courage and the skill to see justice done. Eleanor watched Cole's face as he read, seeing the play of emotions across his weathered features. When he finished, he looked at her with new understanding of the connections that had brought them together. He saved my life during the war, Cole said quietly. I never knew his name, but I remembered his face. Thomas Hartwell was the sergeant who carried wounded men to safety while Confederate cavalry was charging our position. The revelation added new weight to Cole's sense of responsibility toward Eleanor and Benjamin. This was not just about protecting innocent people from criminal violence. It was about honoring a debt to a man who had demonstrated courage under fire and paid the ultimate price for his principles. That's why you couldn't ignore what was happening to us, Eleanor realized. You were repaying an old debt. Maybe it started that way, Cole admitted, but it's become something more than duty. You and Benjamin mean more to me than just keeping a promise to a dead man. The confession hung in the air between them, laden with implications that neither was quite ready to examine fully. They were falling in love, Eleanor realized, with a mixture of joy and terror, finding hope and healing in the midst of desperate circumstances. Cole, she began, but he silenced her with a gentle touch on her lips. Don't say anything you might regret, he warned. Tomorrow we're going to war with some very dangerous people, and there's no guarantee any of us will survive what's coming. But Eleanor was not deterred by the uncertainty of their future. That's exactly why I need to say it now, she replied. I love you, Cole Brennan. I love your courage and your gentleness in the way you care for Benjamin like he was your own son. Cole closed his eyes, feeling emotions he had thought buried forever stirring back to life in his chest. I love you too, he admitted. Both of you, and I'll die before I let Ashford's killers harm either one of you. Their intimate moment was interrupted by a sound that made Cole's blood freeze in his veins. From somewhere in the darkness beyond their cave came the unmistakable sound of a child crying, high-pitched and terrified in a way that spoke of genuine distress. Cole was on his feet instantly, revolver in hand as he moved toward the cave entrance. But something about the sound struck him as wrong, too convenient and perfectly timed to be genuine. Professional killers had been known to use such tactics to lure their targets into vulnerable positions. It's a trap, Cole whispered to Eleanor, who had also heard the crying and started to move toward the sound. Keep Benjamin quiet and away from the entrance. The crying continued for several more minutes, growing more desperate and heart-wrenching with each passing moment. It took tremendous discipline for Eleanor to remain hidden when every maternal instinct screamed at her to help a child in distress. But she trusted Cole's judgment about such matters. When the false crying finally stopped, it was replaced by the sound of men moving through the forest with less care for stealth than they should have shown. Cole counted at least 4 distinct voices calling to each other as they searched for signs of their intended victims. They're not here, one voice complained. Tracks lead right to this area, but there's no sign of them now. Keep looking, another voice replied with authority. Ashford's paying good money for this job, and I don't intend to go back empty-handed. Cole recognized the second voice as belonging to Silas Croft, Ashford's chief enforcer and the man who had led the original pursuit from Eleanor's farm. Croft was a professional killer with a reputation for creative cruelty, and his presence indicated that Ashford was taking their resistance very seriously indeed. The search continued for another hour, with the hunters passing within yards of the cave entrance multiple times without discovering their quarry. Cole had chosen his shelter well, selecting a position that was nearly invisible from any angle and offered multiple escape routes if discovery became inevitable. Eventually, the searchers moved on to examine other areas, their voices fading into the distance as they expanded their search pattern. But Cole knew they would be back, probably with more men and better equipment for a systematic search of the entire region. We can't stay here, Cole announced once he was certain their enemies had moved beyond hearing range. Croft's too good a tracker to give up easily. He'll bring dogs next time, and then our hiding place won't matter. They packed quickly and left the cave before dawn, moving through the pre-dawn darkness with the careful stealth of people who understood that discovery meant death. Cole led them along a route that would confuse tracking dogs, crossing streams and rocky ground that would break up their scent trail. As the sun rose behind heavy clouds that promised more snow, they reached a position that offered a clear view of the valley they had just left. Through his field glasses, Cole could see the search party that had been hunting them, now reinforced with additional men and a pack of tracking hounds. 12 survivors total were regrouping when 25 reinforcements arrived, bringing Ashford's force to 37 men. Crofts taking this seriously. Eleanor studied the distant figures through Cole's field glasses, noting the professional way they organized their search pattern and the quality of their equipment. These were not common bounty hunters motivated solely by greed. They were skilled manhunters who took pride in their deadly profession. "What do we do now?" she asked. Cole was quiet for several minutes, his tactical mind working through their options with the systematic approach that had kept him alive through countless dangerous situations. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the hard certainty of a man who had made a difficult but necessary decision. "We stop running," he said. "It's time to start hunting them instead." The plan that Cole outlined was audacious and dangerous, but it offered their only realistic hope of survival. Instead of continuing to flee toward Red Mesa, they would circle back and begin systematically eliminating their pursuers, using superior knowledge of the terrain to offset the enemy's numerical advantage. "You want us to attack 12 armed men?" Eleanor asked, uncertainty clear in her voice. "I want to pick them off one or two at a time when they're separated and invulnerable," Cole corrected. "Turn their own tactics against them and make Ashford pay such a high price for those documents that he decides to cut his losses." It was a strategy born from Cole's military experience, where outnumbered forces had often achieved victory through superior tactics and willingness to take calculated risks. But it would require careful planning and flawless execution to have any chance of success. As they prepared to implement Cole's dangerous plan, Eleanor found herself thinking about the strange turns her life had taken over the past few months. She had begun this journey as a grieving widow seeking justice for her murdered husband. But somewhere along the way, it had become something much more personal and profound. Looking at Benjamin, who was listening intently as Cole explained basic principles of fieldcraft and concealment, Eleanor realized that they were no longer just fighting for Thomas's legacy. They were fighting for the possibility of a future together, for the chance to build something beautiful from the ashes of their individual tragedies. The thought gave her strength as they began the most dangerous phase of their journey, moving back toward the men who wanted to kill them with nothing but courage and determination to sustain them through the trials ahead. Whatever happened in the coming hours, Eleanor knew that she had found something worth fighting for in the form of Cole Brennan and the love that had grown between them in the midst of violence and desperation. The morning mist clung to the valley floor as they began their approach toward the enemy camp. Three people against impossible odds, but united by bonds that had been forged in the crucible of shared danger. The final confrontation was about to begin. The pre-dawn darkness provided perfect cover as Cole led Eleanor and Benjamin through terrain that he had scouted during their retreat from the cave. His plan required precise timing and intimate knowledge of the landscape, advantages that could offset their enemies' superior numbers and firepower. From their concealed position on a rocky outcrop, Cole studied Silas Croft's camp through his field glasses with the practiced eye of a man who had spent years analyzing enemy positions. 12 men and 4 tracking dogs, just as he had counted earlier, but their distribution revealed tactical weaknesses that an experienced soldier could exploit. The camp showed all the hallmarks of professional organization. Sentries were posted at regular intervals. Weapons were properly maintained and readily accessible, and the men moved with the disciplined efficiency of soldiers rather than common criminals. But Cole could see that their very professionalism would work against them in the kind of unconventional warfare he intended to wage. "They're thinking like an army," Cole explained quietly to Eleanor as she studied the distant camp. "Set positions, predictable patterns, standard operating procedures. That makes them vulnerable to someone who's willing to break the rules." Eleanor watched the systematic way the searchers prepared for another day of hunting, their confidence evident in their casual movements and relaxed attitudes. They clearly believed that finding 3 fugitives in familiar territory was simply a matter of time and persistence. "What exactly are you planning?" she asked, though something in Cole's expression told her that she might not want to know all the details. I'm going to start picking them off when they separate to search different areas, Cole replied with clinical precision. Take out the trackers first, then work on reducing their numbers until Croft realizes he's fighting a war he can't win. The first opportunity came when two men left the main camp to scout a canyon that offered potential hiding places for fugitives. Cole had anticipated this move and positioned himself along their most likely route, using natural cover and careful camouflage to remain invisible until the critical moment. The leading scout passed within arm's reach of Cole's hiding place without detecting his presence, so focused on searching for distant threats that he ignored the immediate danger lurking beside the trail. Cole's knife found its mark silently and efficiently, eliminating one enemy without alerting his companion. The second man realized something was wrong when his partner failed to respond to a routine signal, but his moment of confusion provided Cole with the opening he needed. A carefully thrown rock created a distraction that drew the searcher's attention away from Cole's actual position, allowing him to close distance and strike before his target could raise an alarm. Two men dead, 10 remaining, and Croft's force was already weakened without realizing they were under attack. Cole stripped the bodies of useful ammunition and supplies before carefully concealing them where they would not be discovered until much later. The psychological effect of missing men would be more damaging to enemy morale than the simple reduction in numbers. Professional killers could accept casualties that resulted from direct confrontation, but unexplained disappearances created the kind of fear and uncertainty that destroyed unit cohesion. Cole's next target was the dog handler, a grizzled veteran who managed the tracking hounds with obvious skill and experience. Eliminating him would not only remove another gun from Croft's force, but would also deprive them of their most effective tool for following the fugitive's trail. The opportunity came when the handler moved away from the main group to water his animals at a nearby stream. Cole approached from downstream, moving through the shallow water to mask his scent from the sensitive noses of the tracking dogs. The hounds detected his presence moments before he struck, but their excited whining was attributed to some woodland creature rather than human danger. The handler died quickly and quietly, his throat cut before he could call out a warning or draw his weapon. Cole faced a difficult decision regarding the tracking dogs. They were innocent animals following their training, but they represented a significant threat to Eleanor and Benjamin's safety. Military necessity demanded their elimination, but Cole's conscience rebelled at killing creatures that bore no personal responsibility for their master's crimes. His solution was characteristically practical and humane. Instead of killing the dogs, Cole released them and drove them away from the camp using techniques he had learned from frontier trappers. The animals would eventually find their way to some settlement or ranch where they could live useful lives free from the violence that surrounded their former handlers. By mid-morning, Silas Croft began to realize that his systematic search operation was falling apart. 3 of his men had failed to report back from their assigned sectors, and the tracking dogs had inexplicably disappeared along with their handler. "Something's wrong here," Croft announced to his remaining subordinates, his voice carrying the hard edge of a man who had survived numerous dangerous situations by trusting his instincts. "We're not hunting rabbits anymore. Someone's hunting us." The remaining searchers gathered around their leader with expressions of growing concern. These were men accustomed to being the predators rather than the prey, and the sudden reversal of roles created exactly the kind of psychological pressure that Cole had intended to produce. "Could be Indians," suggested one man, nervously scanning the surrounding forest for signs of hidden enemies. "Indians don't fight this way," Croft replied with certainty born from extensive frontier experience. "This is military tactics, precise and professional. We're dealing with someone who knows what he's doing." Cole smiled grimly from his concealed observation post as he listened to the enemy discussion through the crystal-clear mountain air. Croft was right to be worried, but his tactical assessment was incomplete. This was indeed military warfare, but conducted according to rules that no conventional army would recognize or accept. The next phase of Cole's campaign targeted the enemy's supply line and communications. Professional manhunters required regular resupply of food and ammunition, and they needed reliable methods of communicating with their employer about progress and setbacks. Cole located their pack train and messenger system within hours, using tracking skills learned during his cavalry service to follow the obvious trails that connected Croft's field operation with its supporting infrastructure. A single man with detailed knowledge of local terrain could move much faster than a supply convoy burdened with heavy equipment. The attack on the supply convoy was swift and devastating. Cole positioned himself at a narrow pass where the pack animals would be strung out in single file, vulnerable to assault from elevated positions that offered excellent fields of fire and easy escape routes. His first shots dropped the lead rider and the man bringing up the rear, trapping the pack train in the killing zone while eliminating the most dangerous opponents. The remaining guards found themselves under accurate rifle fire from an invisible enemy who seemed to anticipate their every movement. Within minutes, the entire convoy was scattered or destroyed, its precious supplies scattered across the mountainside, and its surviving members fleeing back toward the main camp with news of their defeat. Cole helped himself to ammunition and medical supplies before setting fire to the rest, sending a column of black smoke into the sky that would be visible for miles. The psychological impact of losing their supply line was exactly what Cole had calculated. Professional soldiers could endure hardship and danger, but the knowledge that they were cut off from resupply and reinforcement created a sense of isolation that eroded fighting effectiveness more surely than direct casualties. Silas Croft's response to these setbacks revealed both his tactical competence and the fundamental weakness of his position. Instead of continuing the search for Eleanor and Benjamin, he ordered his remaining men to concentrate in a defensive perimeter around their base camp. "We're being played," Croft admitted to his subordinates with the bitter honesty of a professional who recognized superior strategy when he encountered it. "Someone's using our own tactics against us, picking us off piece by piece while we stumble around these mountains like greenhorns." The decision to adopt defensive positions was tactically sound but strategically disastrous. By abandoning their offensive mission, Croft was essentially admitting defeat and allowing his quarry to escape while his force slowly disintegrated under constant pressure. Cole observed this tactical shift with satisfaction, recognizing the signs of an enemy who had lost confidence in his ability to complete his assigned mission. But he also understood that desperate men often became more dangerous, not less, and that Croft might attempt some final gambit that could endanger Eleanor and Benjamin. His concerns proved justified when scouts reported that a larger force was approaching from the direction of the territorial road. Ashford had apparently decided that Croft's operation was insufficient and had dispatched additional resources to ensure the elimination of his troublesome witnesses. 20 more men, maybe 25, Cole reported after studying the approaching reinforcements through his field glasses. Professional gunmen, well-equipped and mounted on good horses. Ashford's not taking any chances this time. Eleanor felt her heart sink at this news. They had been making progress against Croft's original force, but facing 35 seasoned killers was beyond even Cole's considerable capabilities. "What do we do now?" she asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. "We change the game completely," Cole replied with grim determination. "If Ashford wants to escalate this conflict, then we'll give him a war he didn't expect." Cole's new strategy was audacious to the point of seeming suicidal, but it offered their only realistic hope of survival against such overwhelming odds. Instead of continuing to fight a guerrilla campaign against superior numbers, he intended to force a decisive confrontation under conditions that would neutralize the enemy's numerical advantage. The plan required them to reach Red Mesa before Ashford's reinforcements could join Croft's survivors, but the route would take them directly through territory controlled by their enemies. It was a desperate gamble that would either achieve complete victory or result in their deaths, with no middle ground between success and failure. "You're talking about fighting our way through 35 armed men," Eleanor observed with understandable concern. "I'm talking about not giving them the chance to coordinate their efforts," Cole corrected. "Hit them while they're still separated, disrupt their communications, and reach Red Mesa before they can organize an effective pursuit." The journey toward Red Mesa began under cover of darkness, with Cole leading Eleanor and Benjamin along trails that he had memorized during his years of hunting dangerous men throughout the territory. They moved with the careful silence of people who understood that a single mistake could mean death for all of them. Benjamin had adapted to their circumstances with the remarkable resilience that children sometimes displayed when faced with adult dangers. The boy asked no questions about their dangerous situation, seeming to understand intuitively that silence and obedience were essential for their survival. The first sign of enemy activity came as they approached a ridge that offered the only practical route toward their destination. Cole's field glasses revealed sentries posted at strategic intervals, their positions chosen to provide overlapping fields of fire across any approach to the high ground. 6 men that I can see, probably more hidden in reserve, Cole reported after a careful reconnaissance of the enemy positions. They're expecting us to come this way. Eleanor studied the tactical situation through Cole's field glasses, trying to understand the military considerations that would determine their next move. The enemy positions appeared impregnable to her civilian eyes, but she had learned to trust Cole's professional judgment about such matters. "Can we go around?" she suggested. "Not without adding 2 days to our journey," Cole replied. "And Ashford's reinforcements will be here by tomorrow morning. If we don't break through tonight, we'll never reach Red Mesa alive." The assault on the ridge positions required careful coordination and precise timing, qualities that were difficult to achieve with only 3 people, one of whom was a 6-year-old child. But Cole had faced similar challenges during the war, and he understood how to use surprise and aggression to overcome superior defensive positions. "Eleanor, I need you to create a distraction on the left flank," Cole explained as he outlined his tactical plan. "Nothing dangerous, just enough noise and movement to draw their attention while I work around to their blind side." "What about Benjamin?" Eleanor asked, clearly reluctant to involve her son in the active combat operations. "He stays with me," Cole decided. "I can protect him better than you can protect yourself in a firefight." The plan unfolded with military precision despite its desperate nature. Eleanor's diversionary tactics succeeded in focusing enemy attention away from Cole's actual approach route, allowing him to close distance while the sentries were distracted by movement in the wrong direction. Cole's assault on the ridge positions was swift and devastating. His first shots eliminated 2 sentries before they could raise an alarm, while his rapid movement between firing positions created the impression of multiple attackers advancing from different directions. The surviving defenders, confused by the sudden violence erupting around them and unable to identify their attackers' actual numbers or positions, began falling back towards secondary positions that Cole had already identified and flanked. Within 20 minutes, the entire enemy force was either dead or fleeing through the darkness, leaving Cole in control of the strategic high ground that commanded the approaches to Red Mesa. The victory had been achieved at the cost of significant ammunition expenditure, but it opened the route to their destination. As they continued their journey through the captured positions, Eleanor marveled at the tactical skill that Cole had demonstrated in overcoming such formidable obstacles. But she also noticed the physical and emotional toll that constant violence was exacting on the man she had come to love. "You can't keep doing this forever," she observed as they paused to rest during the final approach to Red Mesa. "I won't have to," Cole replied with quiet confidence. "Once we reach the federal marshal, this becomes a legal matter instead of a shooting war. Ashford's money won't protect him from federal prosecution if we can present our evidence properly." Red Mesa appeared through the morning mist like a vision of salvation, its collection of rough buildings and busy streets representing safety and civilization after days of violence and desperate flight through the wilderness. But Cole's experienced eye detected signs that their enemies had anticipated this destination and prepared accordingly. "Too quiet," Cole observed as they studied the town from a concealed position among the rocks above the main street. "Normal towns have more activity this time of morning, people going about their business, children playing, merchants opening their stores." Eleanor followed his gaze, trying to see what had triggered his professional caution. Red Mesa did appear unusually subdued for a frontier settlement that should have been bustling with morning commerce and social activity. "You think Ashford's people are already here?" she asked. "I think we're walking into the biggest trap yet," Cole replied grimly. "But we don't have much choice. Those documents won't do any good unless we can get them to Federal Marshal Hampton, and he's somewhere in that town." Their approach to Red Mesa required the same careful planning that had characterized all of Cole's tactical operations throughout their journey. Instead of riding directly down the main street like normal travelers, they circled around to approach from an unexpected direction that would offer concealment and multiple escape routes. The first confirmation of Cole's suspicions came when they spotted armed men positioned on rooftops and in alleyways throughout the town center. These were not local residents going about their daily business, but professional gunmen who had been strategically placed to control key intersections and eliminate specific targets. Ashford's turned the whole town into a killing ground, Cole realized with growing admiration for his opponent's tactical thinking. He's got us caught between his field forces behind us and his town defenders ahead of us. But Cole had not survived 4 years of civil war and 6 years of bounty hunting without learning how to recognize and exploit enemy weaknesses, even in apparently hopeless situations. The very comprehensiveness of Ashford's trap contained the seeds of its own defeat. "They're expecting us to come in shooting," Cole explained to Eleanor as he formulated his counter strategy. "Instead, we're going to walk in bold as brass and let them wonder what we're planning." Eleanor looked at him with alarm. "You want us to just surrender?" "I want us to act like people who have nothing to fear because we're about to turn the tables completely," Cole corrected. Ashford's made one critical mistake in all of this. He's assumed that we're operating alone. The revelation that Cole had been in communication with federal authorities throughout their journey came as a complete surprise to Eleanor. During their various stops and encounters, Cole had been leaving coded messages and signals that would be recognized by law enforcement officials who were already investigating railroad corruption. Federal Marshal Hampton has been tracking Ashford's activities for months, Cole explained as they prepared for their final gambit. "Your husband's evidence was the missing piece he needed to build an airtight case, but he needed to get it through official channels rather than from fugitives running from hired killers." The plan that Cole outlined was breathtakingly audacious and completely dependent on precise timing and coordination with forces that Eleanor could not see. But it offered their only realistic hope of surviving the trap that Ashford had prepared, while ensuring that Thomas's evidence reached the proper authorities. They entered Red Mesa walking hand in hand down the center of the main street, with Benjamin between them and Eleanor carrying the precious satchel in plain sight. To observers, they appeared to be a family going about routine business rather than fugitives fleeing from professional killers. The tension was palpable as they passed between buildings that concealed armed men waiting for the signal to begin shooting. Eleanor could feel hostile eyes tracking their movement from windows and doorways, calculating angles and distances while fingers rested on triggers. But Cole's gamble proved successful. The very boldness of their approach created confusion among Ashford's forces, who had been prepared for a desperate assault or covert infiltration, rather than this calm walk through the heart of their ambush. The federal marshal's office occupied a solid stone building near the center of town, its American flag hanging limp in the still air. Cole led his small family up the front steps with the confidence of a man who knew exactly what he was doing, though Eleanor could see the tension in his shoulders as he prepared for whatever would happen next. Marshal Hampton proved to be a lean, weathered man in his 50s, with intelligent eyes that missed nothing and the quiet authority that came from years of enforcing federal law in dangerous territory. He looked up from his paperwork as they entered, his expression showing no surprise at their arrival. "Mr. Brennan," Hampton said with a slight nod, "I've been expecting you. I trust you have something for me." Eleanor handed over the leather satchel containing Thomas's carefully gathered evidence, watching as the federal marshal examined the documents with the expertise of someone who understood their legal significance. His expression grew increasingly grim as he read through the proof of Ashford's criminal conspiracy. "This is everything we need to prosecute not just Ashford, but his entire network of corruption," Hampton announced with satisfaction. "Railroad executives, territorial officials, federal employees. This evidence will bring it down the whole rotten structure." The sound of gunfire erupting in the street outside interrupted their conversation, signaling that Ashford's forces had finally decided to act despite their uncertainty about the situation. Cole moved quickly to a window that offered a view of the main street, where armed men were emerging from their concealment to surround the marshal's office. "Looks like Ashford's decided to make his play," Cole observed with professional detachment. "How many deputies do you have available, Marshal?" 12 good men, all experienced in this kind of work," Hampton replied as he began checking his weapons, "plus about 20 townspeople who are tired of being intimidated by Ashford's hired guns." Eleanor realized that Cole's seemingly desperate gamble had actually been a carefully planned operation designed to draw all of Ashford's forces into one location where they could be confronted by superior legal authority. The trap that had been set for them was about to become a trap for their enemies. The battle for Red Mesa unfolded with the swift violence that characterized frontier justice when federal authority finally confronted corporate corruption. Ashford's hired guns found themselves facing not just Cole Brennan and his companions, but a coordinated force of federal marshals and angry townspeople who had endured months of intimidation and violence. Cole positioned himself at a strategic window where his rifle could command the main street, picking his targets with the precision that had made him legendary among those who knew his reputation. Each shot was carefully aimed and devastatingly effective, reducing the enemy's numbers while conserving his limited ammunition. Eleanor found herself pressed into service-loading weapons and treating wounded defenders, her hands steady despite the chaos erupting around them. Benjamin, with the adaptability that had characterized his behavior throughout their ordeal, helped by carrying messages and supplies to positions where they were needed most. The tide of battle turned decisively when Silas Croft himself appeared on the main street, leading the final assault in person rather than directing it from a safe distance. His presence galvanized the remaining hired guns, but it also provided Cole with the target he had been seeking throughout their long conflict. The confrontation between Cole and Croft unfolded in the classic tradition of frontier justice, two skilled gunmen facing each other across dusty street while civilians watched from protected positions. But this was not a formal duel governed by codes of honor. This was a fight to the death between representatives of law and lawlessness. Cole's shot came a fraction of a second faster than his opponent's, the heavy bullet striking Croft's center mass and spinning him around before he collapsed into the dust. The death of their leader broke the morale of the remaining hired guns, who began surrendering or fleeing rather than continuing a fight they could no longer win. The aftermath of the battle brought swift and decisive action from federal authorities who had been preparing for this confrontation for months. Within hours, arrest warrants were being served on corrupt officials throughout the territory, while telegraph messages carried news of Ashford's downfall to investigators in Washington, D.C. Marcus Ashford himself was arrested at his Denver mansion, taken into custody by federal marshals who had coordinated their timing with the action in Red Mesa. The railroad baron's wealth and political connections proved insufficient protection against the overwhelming evidence that Thomas Hartwell had died to preserve. "He'll stand trial for conspiracy, murder, and theft of federal land," Marshal Hampton explained to Eleanor as they watched the prisoners being loaded into wagons for transport to the territorial capital. "The evidence your husband gathered will ensure that he spends the rest of his life in federal prison if he's not hanged for the murders he ordered." Eleanor felt a profound sense of closure as she watched justice finally being served for Thomas's death and the suffering of so many innocent families. The documents that had cost her husband his life would now ensure that his sacrifice had not been in vain. But as satisfying as this legal victory was, Eleanor found her attention increasingly focused on the personal future that was taking shape before her. Cole had survived the violence that had brought them together, and now they faced the challenge of building something positive from the bonds that had been forged in desperate circumstances. "What happens to us now?" Eleanor asked as they stood together on the porch of the hotel, where Marshal Hampton had arranged for their accommodation while the legal proceedings were completed. "That depends on what you want to happen," Cole replied, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty that seemed strange coming from a man who had faced death with such calm confidence. "I've got some money saved up, enough to buy a small ranch somewhere peaceful. Benjamin deserves a chance to grow up without worrying about hired guns and corrupt officials." Eleanor looked at this man who had risked everything to protect her family, seeing not just the skilled gunfighter who had kept them alive, but the gentle soul who had comforted her son and shown her that love could grow even in the darkest circumstances. "I think," she said carefully, "that Benjamin needs a father, and I need a husband, if you're willing to take on that responsibility." Cole's answer came in the form of a kiss that promised everything they had been afraid to hope for during their desperate flight through the winter wilderness. When they finally separated, both were smiling with the quiet joy of people who had discovered that second chances were possible, even after terrible loss. The wedding took place 6 weeks later in the small church at Red Mesa, with Federal Marshal Hampton serving as both witness and the man who gave Eleanor away. Benjamin stood proud beside Cole as his new stepfather exchanged vows with his mother, The boys' face bright with happiness at finally having a complete family again. The legal proceedings that followed Ashford's arrest continued for months, but Eleanor and Cole were largely insulated from the complexities of federal prosecution by their new life on a ranch outside Red Mesa. The property that Cole purchased with his savings and the reward money he received for bringing down Ashford's criminal network provided a perfect setting for their growing family. Benjamin thrived in his new environment, learning horseback riding and ranch work from Cole while continuing his education under Eleanor's careful tutelage. The boy's natural intelligence and courage, refined by the hardships he had endured, promised great things for his future. Eleanor found deep satisfaction in creating a home that honored Thomas's memory while embracing the new love that had entered her life. She established a school for the children of local ranchers and farmers, ensuring that education would be available to the next generation, regardless of their family's financial circumstances. Cole channeled his military skills and frontier experience into legitimate pursuits, serving as a deputy federal marshal when his expertise was needed, while focusing primarily on building up their ranch and caring for his new family. The violence that had characterized his previous life gave way to the peaceful satisfactions of honest work and domestic happiness. The winter of 1883 brought snow to their valley, just as it had during that terrible season when they first met. But now the cold meant nothing more than the need for warmer clothes and a larger woodpile. Eleanor stood at the window of their comfortable ranch house, watching Cole teach their two daughters how to build snowmen, while Benjamin, now 11 and tall for his age, helped his stepfather with the afternoon chores. The satchel that had contained Thomas's evidence sat in a place of honor on the mantelpiece, its leather worn but carefully preserved as a reminder of the sacrifice that had made their current happiness possible. Inside were newspaper clippings documenting Ashford's conviction and execution, along with letters from families who had regained their farms thanks to the evidence that Thomas had died to preserve. Eleanor's hand rested on her swollen belly, where their third child grew strong and healthy. Cole had expressed hope for another son to help with the ranch work, but Eleanor suspected he would be just as delighted with another daughter to spoil and protect. The sound of approaching horses drew her attention to the road that led toward Red Mesa, where a familiar figure was riding toward their house with the easy confidence of someone who was always welcome. Federal Marshal Hampton had become a regular visitor over the years, bringing news of the outside world and enjoying the peaceful hospitality that their home provided. "Thought you'd want to know," Hampton announced as he dismounted and accepted the cup of coffee that Eleanor brought him. "The last of Ashford's associates was convicted yesterday. Judge sentenced him to 20 years in federal prison. The railroad corruption investigation is finally closed." Eleanor nodded with quiet satisfaction, understanding that this news marked the end of a chapter that had begun with Thomas's murder and continued through all the dangers and hardships that had brought her to this place of safety and happiness. That evening was fading as the family gathered around their dinner table for the daily ritual that had become the foundation of their new life. Eleanor looked at each face illuminated by the warm glow of lamplight. Benjamin, growing into the kind of young man that Thomas would have been proud to call his son. Cole, weathered and scarred by his past, but made gentle by love and purpose. Their two little daughters, bright and curious and innocent of the violence that had shaped their parents' early relationship. "What are you thinking about, Mama?" Benjamin asked, noting the thoughtful expression on her face. "I'm thinking about how sometimes the worst things that happen to us can lead to the best things we never imagined possible," Eleanor replied, reaching across the table to take Cole's hand in hers. "And I'm thinking about how grateful I am for every moment that brought us to this place." Cole squeezed her hand gently, understanding the depth of emotion behind her simple words. They had both lost so much in their earlier lives, but they had found something together that neither could have achieved alone. Love born from tragedy, hope growing from despair, and a family built from the ashes of their individual sorrows. Outside, snow continued to fall across their peaceful valley, covering the land in pristine white that promised renewal and new beginnings. But inside their warm home, surrounded by the people they loved most in the world, Eleanor and Cole Brennan knew that they had already found everything they would ever need. The frontier still held dangers and hardships for those who were unprepared to face them, but for one family who had proven that courage and love could overcome any obstacle, the future stretched ahead bright with promise and possibility. They had survived the winter of their greatest trial, and now they would enjoy the spring of their well-earned happiness. In the distance, a coyote called across the snow-covered ranges, its voice carrying the wild freedom that still characterized this untamed land. But in the Brennan Ranch house, that sound was simply part of the natural symphony that sang their children to sleep each night, a lullaby of peace and security that their parents had purchased with blood and sacrifice, and the unwavering determination to protect those they loved above all else.